Last time we got down to ready to start verse 33, you'll remember that the situation we're looking at is Paul had gone to Jerusalem with warnings that he was going to be bound in Jerusalem. It didn't say who was going to bind him, but we know that both the Jews and the Romans were involved in binding him in just two different ways. We often think of the word binding as someone who is bound by a rope or a chain or handcuffs or something like this. But there are two different kinds of binding that takes place. One is somebody latching hold of a person by their arm or something of that nature and leading them, or that can be with physical restraints such as a rope or handcuffs or something of that nature. And they took, or they attacked him in the synagogue or in the temple. And remember, it was not the Jews of Jerusalem that did this, but rather it was the Jews from Asia. And my best guess is I believe it was probably someone from Ephesus, where Paul had had a lot of discouragement, so to speak, from the Jews and attacks by them there. But be that as it may, if it was somewhere else, that's okay. It still gets to the same place in Asia. And we noticed that he was attacked, and the soldiers saw this, and we talked about the fact that a castle had been built by Herod the Great above the temple area where one of the four towers that were on this fortress was built where it could overlook down into the temple area. There were also two staircases that led from the castle, as it's called, the castle of Anton, that led down into the temple area. And so the soldiers were always watching, especially in times where these special days of the Jews were, because they knew how violent the Jews could become, and so they were really on guard. We also talked about the idea that the Romans were always ready to fight at a moment's notice. Many times they wore their armor and carried their weapons, especially, again, Josephus told us, in the time of Jewish feast days, because they were ready at an instant's notice to fight. And so we see all of this. And we see that the soldiers came down out of the castle, the fortress, and they rescued Paul. And we made mention of the fact that when they saw, that is, the Jews saw the soldiers, and the only way they could have seen them is them coming down this stairway, because the ones in the middle who would have been beating him, and remember the temple complex at this time would have had tens of thousands of people surrounding it and in the temple at that time because of the holiday season for the Jews. And so if the soldiers had been coming at them on level ground, those in the middle would not have stopped beating Paul because they wouldn't have seen him. But those could look up and see, here come the Roman soldiers, this unbelievable killing machine of that time. And that brings us then to verse 33 and 34. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with two chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another, among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. Now, the chief captain made an assumption that probably any law enforcement officer even today would probably do in a situation like that. Here's a great crowd of people and they're attacking one person. What did he do? I want to know. Well, this fulfilled, notice, the prophecy of Agabus and others who had been telling Paul all on his journey toward Jerusalem that he was going to be bound in Jerusalem and that persecution of some kind is waiting for him. So prophecies fulfilled. The Jews had laid hands on Paul, and also the Romans now ordered him to be chained with two chains. Now, That's important because today, if a prisoner is going to be, quote, chained to a law enforcement officer, what that usually means is he's going to have one hand in a handcuff and the other hand's handcuffed to the officer. Or rather, yeah, he's going to be handcuffed to an officer. But in their time, 2 chains usually signified that a man was being chained to 2 soldiers. We saw the same thing with regard to Peter earlier in the book of Acts when he was imprisoned and he was chained to 2 guards in that prison cell. But we go back and we remember Agabus had come to where Paul was in Caesarea. He's going to be traveling to Rome from Caesarea, or to Jerusalem rather, and he took the girdle or the belt of the Apostle Paul and tied his own hands with it and said, this is what's waiting for the one who owns this girdle, this belt. Lysias is the commander. We noticed also that his title in the Greek in this context showed that he was the commander of 1,000. He was, some label it a centurion of the centurions. There were 10 centurions that made up the 1,000 cohort, and thus a centurion of the centurions recognized someone who was in charge of 1,000 men. And they descend on this mob. And the mob's not going to attack them. It's not like here in America it's gotten to be where, you know, our police officers seem to be ambushed on almost a daily basis in some places. Yeah, some not being shot, but that's sad when there's no recognition of the authority of police and there's no fear of them. Lysias commanded Paul to be bound thus with 2 chains, and he wants an answer. What did this man do? You know, what did he do that was so bad that everybody's against him? That's the idea. Now notice the answer. Some cried one thing and some another. They didn't know. A lot of these folks had no idea what he did. They're just throwing out accusations. It's kind of like politicians nowadays that will throw out things and let's see if it sticks. Well, none of it stuck. In Mark 14:55 and 56, notice it says, the chief priests and all the council sought to witness against Jesus to put him to death. And what? They didn't find any. Oh, they found some folks that bore false witness against Jesus. But notice they couldn't back each other up. They didn't have any 2 that really agreed with each other, at least initially. That seems to be the exact same situation that we see here with Paul with regard to the Jews trying to answer the centurion of the centurions question. What did he do? So Lysias commanded that Paul be carried to the castle, the fortress. This word carried is an interesting word because it comes from the word ago, and I think the English translation here is unfortunate because the word itself means properly to lead. They led Paul. Both Strong and Thayer's agree to that, the meaning of that word. And then you have the word castle, parambolai, and it means to throw in beside. That is, in battle array, encampment, or barracks. And so the idea is that he's being taken into the encampment of the Romans and into the area where their barracks are. And there's the hint by Thayer, or Strong rather, that it was in battle array. In other words, they formed into particularly a unit to protect him as they marched him toward the barracks. This was the castle of what we call Antonia. And consider something with me, if you will, with regard to the providence of God in these events. Think about how God is orchestrating these events by people He knows. He knows how they're going to react. He knows what they're going to do to Paul ahead of time, and everything is placed in an order, so to speak. The Jews, if they'd been given just a few more minutes, would have probably killed Paul by beating him to death. And notice that the Jews murdering Paul would have been anywhere but the temple itself. Get him out into the court of the Gentiles or beyond that, and now he's fair game. And they were going to kill him. And Paul would never have reached Rome. God's providence is protecting Paul from these men. And then also consider the centurion. Lysias, as we'll learn his name later in the text, Lysias is an honest centurion. He's a fair centurion. He's not going to just let the mob kill this man. He wants to find out what's going on. If the man deserved death for something that he'd done, say he murdered the high priest, no doubt the Romans would have executed Paul. But here's a fair man. He's going to examine the evidence. He's going to make decisions based on the evidence. And just a side note, consider that every single centurion that is mentioned in the New Testament, only good is said about them. Isn't that interesting? Only good. And we know that there were centurions that weren't honest, who were greedy, who did everything they could to accumulate wealth. That was not unheard of at all among the Roman armies. But every centurion that's mentioned in the New Testament, nothing but good is said about them. And so it is here with Lysias. He's honest. He's going to listen to the evidence. He shows all of this, and then he's going to make a decision. Notice for the rest of the book of Acts, Paul is going to remain in the hands of the Gentiles. He's going to remain for the rest of the book of Acts as a prisoner of the Romans, the Gentiles. Look at verse 35 and 36. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, "Away with him." Now, we talked about the stairs as being wide enough for the soldiers to come pouring down. These were not stairs that were just wide enough for one person. Now, remember, there are two sets of stairs that come down into one on the west side of the temple complex, one on the north side of the temple complex. These were built by Herod the Great, along with the fortress, or actually he rebuilt the fortress, and he'd rebuilt the temple, made it a magnificent place. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now, when they approach the stairs and when they're going to it, them leading up to the fortress, it says that Paul was born of the soldiers for the violence of the people. The word born here is bastadzo, and this means it can be used literally or figuratively to bear someone up. Literally, it would mean they picked him up and they carried him. Figuratively means that they would have surrounded him in such a way that they're just moving like a wave of the sea, moving up this staircase. Thayer tells us that it means to take up with the hands. That is, to sustain or to uphold or support him as they're going up the stairs. We can understand why that would be. Remember, the Jews had been beating Paul before the soldiers got there, and so he may have been weakened to some extent. We don't know. We are not given enough details to know that. And the crowd What are they doing as the soldiers are moving up the staircase with the Apostle Paul? They're crying out, "Away with him." It mirrors their feelings about Jesus, doesn't it? Isn't that the same thing in John 19? Or rather in John 19 and verse 15 that was said about the Jews and their reaction to Jesus? Away with him. The idea of this is they're looking at him as someone who is not fit to be alive. That was the idea behind their words. And notice the words that about Paul when they interpreted his speech in Acts 22 and verse 22. Away with such a fellow, what? From the earth. In other words, kill him. He's not worth living. His life is not worth anything. In fact, they went on in that same verse to say, for it is not fit that he should live. So later these Jews are going to make an attempt to assassinate Paul, again because they felt like he wasn't worth living, but that's still in the future. Right now, we're looking at what happens when the soldiers are leading Paul up away from this mob into or toward entering the barracks complex or the camp of the Romans. And that brings us into verse 37 and 38. And as Paul was led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, May I speak unto thee? Watch this. Who said, Canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian which before these days madest an uproar and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? As Paul was being led into the castle, now this could be anywhere on the staircase, because that's the goal, leading into the castle, the encampment. He spoke to the chief captain, the centurion of centurions. Notice, it appears that as I visualize this in my mind, he's up almost to the top, about to be led inside the walls, and he speaks to the centurion of centurions. Paul asked, Can I speak to you, Lysias? And notice the surprise that Lysias exhibits on this occasion. He heard Paul speak in Greek and he said, What? You know, and the way we would say it, what? You can speak Greek? Why would he then draw a conclusion as to this Greek-speaking person that he's talking to associated with an Egyptian? Have you thought about that? Notice, he doesn't know anything about Paul's background. Not at this point. They couldn't give him any kind of information. The Jews, when they were trying to accuse him, they didn't have any consistency in the charges that they were making. He didn't have any idea who Paul was. Lysias thought Paul was an insurrectionist. Now, why would he think that? He thought that he was an Egyptian troublemaker that had been known and, by the way, was on Rome's hit list. Now, we'll get into that in just a minute. Art thou that Egyptian? A specific Egyptian, which before these days made an uproar? You see, instead of hearing Paul speak in Aramaic, he heard Paul speak in Greek. The Egyptians spoke Greek. Why? Oh, Alexander had conquered Egypt long before this time, and they were then later ruled by the Ptolemaics, who were the Greeks. In fact, Ptolemy was a Greek general who, when Alexander died, his kingdom was divided into those four major generals of his. One of them was the Ptolemaic lineage. and they spoke Greek. There's another famous person that spoke Greek, although born in Egypt, and it was in the Ptolemaic line. Who was she? Cleopatra. And this was their tradition. They were speaking the language because it had come to be such a well-known language in their nation because of who had conquered them and who had then taken over after Alexander died. They knew the Greek language and they spoke it. And so he jumped to the conclusion, because Paul spoke to him in Greek instead of Aramaic or Latin, oh, you must be that guy that caused so much trouble before, and the guy we're still looking for. Josephus records that there was an Egyptian about 3 years before the events of our text who claimed that he was the Messiah the Jews were looking for. He led an army against Jerusalem, which at that time, again, was controlled by Rome. And Felix, being the governor of that particular area at that time, used the army to attack these rebels. He killed 400 of them and captured 200. But the Egyptian escaped. So now he is on Rome's most wanted list. He's on their hit list. They wanted him. And Lysias seems to have thought, you're that Egyptian. Now there's something interesting here too about who the Egyptian had led. Notice the centurion said that 4,000 men that were murderers. The word murderers here is also a very interesting, it's very specific. These were murderers of a certain kind. The Greek word here is sekareos, and what it means is a dagger man or an assassin. Thayer tells us and adds this information. An assassin, one who carries a dagger or short sword under his clothing for the purpose of secretly and treacherously killing anyone he wishes to. There was a sect of the Jews who hated the Romans so much that they were known as these sikareos. They were the assassins. So what the centurion is saying to Paul is, aren't you that Egyptian that led 4,000 men who were assassins, dagger men? What these men would do is they would conceal their daggers or short sword under their clothing, and then they would mingle, especially on feast days of the Jews, in with among the people, and particularly they would murder someone who was a pro-Roman. Roper said that these assassins mingled with the crowds during festivals to get close to pro-Roman adversaries. They were very anti-Roman, wanting to overthrow the Roman government. He goes on to say they would secretly thrust their daggers into their enemies and then blend in with the horrified crowd. They were part of the general Jewish rebellion that finally resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem. You know, you and I, unless we really look into the background of the destruction of Rome or Jerusalem in 70 A.D., we might think that this was something that happened just real quickly. No, this was in the making approximately 10 years or more before the actual destruction of Jerusalem. It was being antagonized by these assassins, by others who wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire, and it kept building and building and building until finally Rome said, that's enough. We're sick and tired of it, and Jerusalem, you're going to be destroyed. And they did. Look at verse 31. Where am I? What's going on here?
39.
Verse 39. Okay. But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people, and when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue. Again, imagine the surprise that Lysias must have had when he started hearing Paul's pedigree. He's a Jew. He's not that Egyptian. And he's from where? Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. Under the Roman system, Tarsus was a free city. And what that meant is that a person who was born in the city of Tarsus was automatically a Roman citizen. Just like in the United States, if you're born in the United States, you're already an American citizen. That's why so many of these illegals come across bearing a baby in their womb. If they can get into the United States and that baby is born in the United States, that baby is now an American citizen. There's a little bit of pushback, by the way, going on about that in the state of Texas. We'll see how that all works out. But under the Roman system, because Paul was born in Tarsus, in Cilicia, he was a Roman citizen. It's interesting to me that Lysias did not seem to pick up on that immediately. Citizens of this city were Roman citizens. Tarsus itself was a cultural city in its time. It had a university there that rivaled the universities in Athens and Alexandria, Egypt. They were very zealous, especially of one area of study, and that was philosophical studies. The phrase "no mean city" means that Tarsus was an important city. It wasn't just simply a city. It wasn't a city that didn't have any influence. It was a very influential city, a Roman citizen city. Jackson, in his commentary, tells us that there were about 500,000 people in this city in its zenith. It was also known as a lumber and what was built from lumber or made from lumber and linen industries, known very well for those particular industries. And what did Paul then say to Lysias? I beseech thee. He gave him his pedigree, and now he says, I'm begging you for the privilege. What privilege? Let me speak to the people. Let me speak to them. Now notice, why did Paul plead with Lysias for the right to speak to these Jewish people when they had just tried to murder him? And notice something else about Paul. There doesn't seem to be any anger being exhibited to these people who just tried to murder him. Instead, what we see is a calm, tranquil state, a forgiving and merciful nature. I want to talk to these people. And those characteristics are seen once we start seeing him speak to the Jews. He didn't act vindictively against them. He didn't act in an angry manner. Why? He's acting like his Lord. He's acting like his master. He's thinking about their souls. I wonder how you and I would react today if some government agency came in and beat us and threatened us with death, etc. how would we react? What would we, it's easy for us right now to sit back and say, oh, I know what we'd do. We'd try and teach them about Jesus. But would we? In Romans 10 and verse 1, we remember that Paul said, brethren, talking about the Jews, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. This was what Paul was all about. This is what Jesus was all about. Came into the midst of his enemies and died on the cross trying to save their souls, to give them the soul-saving message, so to speak. Paul is just like his master. He wanted the opportunity to teach these people. So he didn't lash out at them. He spoke calmly to them, even though they just tried to murder him. He's calmly going to show them what God had done in his life and how the Gentiles were acceptable to God. And we're going to see that played out a little differently later toward the end of his speech, when they would no longer allow him to speak. Look at verse 40. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, and that'll be the next chapter. But now notice, Lysias gives him permission, gives him the freedom to speak to these Jews who had been trying to kill Paul. Maybe Lysias, and I was trying to put myself in Lysias' place. If I had been Lysias and I tried to find out what Paul had done, and I got no real answer and all confusion and no way to tell exactly, maybe he kind of thought, well, if I let him speak to him, maybe I'll find out what he did that got them so riled up. Notice Paul beckoned with a hand. The word beckoned, it gives us a picture. It speaks of someone who's using the hands, waving them in such a way as to quiet a mob. What do? If we're trying to quiet somebody, we often we see politicians or others speaking to large groups, they'll take their hands and we want to say something, and that's what this word means, to sway downward. That is, to make a signal. He was signaling to them that I've got something to say. And what I find amazing is that this frenzied crowd quieted down. Here's the man motioning with his hands for quiet so that he can speak to them. And they'd been drowning him out before this time, and now, all of a sudden, they get quiet. They quiet down. And Paul begins to speak to them in the Hebrew tongue. Now, this is not the Hebrew of the Old Testament that's being spoken about. That's not what this is. Because at this particular point in time and for several hundred years, the Jews who were living in what we call the Palestinian area or Palestine, they spoke in Aramaic. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. The apostles spoke in Aramaic. So when it says he's speaking to them in the Hebrew tongue, he's speaking to them in the language that they spoke at that time. So let's go ahead and go into chapter 22 and notice verses 1 and 2. Paul's going to begin his speech to them. Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, he kept the more silence, and he saith. So he's going to make his defense. And what subject is Paul primarily going to defend himself against? Notice what he says. The general charge against him basically is going to be he's disrespecting his heritage. He's disrespecting the law of Moses. He's disrespecting the temple. Remember the charges that were made? Oh, he brought a Gentile. What would that be? Disrespecting the temple. Oh, he's teaching the Jews in these travels not to have their children circumcised. The heritage of the Jews. So these are the things that he's going to talk about. And notice how he begins. Men, brethren, and fathers. There's the family heritage of the Jews. Men, brethren, fathers. And what he's showing them is, I'm not disrespecting my Hebrew heritage. Hebrew. I'm not disrespecting you, brethren. These weren't Christians attacking Paul. These were law of Moses, Jews attacking Paul. There are some that think that Paul actually spoke in the Old Hebrew, but that's not what the text is telling us. And notice that when he addressed them, men, brethren, fathers, he's speaking politely and respectfully to them. And these are the people that just moments before were trying to murder him. Yet he speaks to them politely and with respect. Again, how would we react under circumstances similar to that? It's a legitimate question that we ought to ask ourselves. And if we don't prepare ourselves ahead of time, that if we were in that situation, then there's no way we'll do as Paul did. It should be remembered that the context of these events happened about 10 years before the temple was destroyed. They've got about 10 years of the life of the temple left. The law of Moses being practiced in a primary religious sense by some of the Jews. Now, the law of Moses doesn't exist in this time. I'm just offering the idea of the Jews who would not accept Christianity. To them, that's still everything. And with the destruction of that temple is going to be something that absolutely makes it impossible to worship under the law of Moses. The destruction of all of the genealogical records. They will no longer be able to say, oh, this man is from the tribe of Levi and he is a priest. He's not only from the tribe of Levi, but he's from that specific family that was designated to be priest. No, they won't be able to do it anymore. And without those priests, the law of Moses, the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law can no longer be legitimately expressed. Can't be taught. They have no backup. So the Jews, in a sense, are being given another chance by Paul to repent. And they're not going to take it as a whole. Those ancestral records are going to be destroyed. And thus, they have no basis upon which to practice what they were practicing at that time, the Mosaic law. Look at verse 3. I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city, Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. Why did Paul speak now about this pedigree? The crowd had not agreed on the charges brought against him. This would indicate that some in this crowd probably didn't have any idea who Paul was. Probably had no idea what he was being accused of. And so Paul begins, first of all, by identifying himself as one of them. I am a Jew. I may have been born in Tarsus, in Cilicia, but I was taught here in Jerusalem. the perfect manner of the law. Augustus Caesar had made Tarsus a free city, and it's going to play into an advantage for the Apostle Paul in later times. But he was born in Tarsus, raised in Jerusalem. He had been educated in all of the Jewish oral law as well as the law of Moses by Gamaliel. Gamaliel was one of the greatest teachers of the Jews that they'd ever produced. And I want us to think about Gamaliel for a minute. Who was Gamaliel? Well, say, oh, well, he was a great Jewish teacher. Yeah, but there's more to it than that. I want you to notice what the Encyclopedia Britannica said about Gamaliel. And in my looking at a lot of other stuff, I chose to put down what is said there in the Britannica encyclopedias because they tended to condense it a lot better. It says Gamaliel the First, that he was Gamaliel the First, also called Rabban Gamaliel. Rabban meaning teacher, but there's something special about that. He goes on to say, it flourished in the 1st century A.D., a Tanna, and that's another title that he was given, a Tanna, T-A-N-N-A, one of a select group of Palestinian masters, listen to him, of the Jewish oral law and a teacher twice mentioned in the New Testament. Gamaliel held a leading position in the Sanhedrin and enjoyed the highest repute as a teacher of the law of Moses. He was the first to be given the title Rabban. That's a higher title than the word rabbi or master. He was the first one to ever be given that title. It's interesting that later in the New Testament, we will see that Jesus was also called Rabban on one occasion as a translation from the original. Like his grandfather was the great teacher Hillel. Gamaliel also was given the title of Hazakin, Hazaquin, the elder. So he had all of these titles. Gamaliel was considered to be the greatest teacher of not just the law of Moses, but the oral traditions of the Jews, the oral law. And that's who Gamaliel is. Paul had him as his teacher. And these credentials made Paul somebody that deserved attention. That's why he's doing this. It's going to help him to get them to listen to what he said. And notice it then says that he says, I was zealous toward God the same as you are today. That very day when they are so zealous, they're going to murder Paul. Because they said he spoke against the law of Moses. He committed trespass against the temple. And that's where we're going to pick up next week with verse 4 and 5. We'll discuss some of this just a little more then.